People think when you live to 90, you eventually make peace with most things. I suppose that's true for small regrets, the harsh words you said to a friend, or the chances you were too afraid to take. Time has a way of sanding those edges down, but there is one memory that never softened. I was 21 years old, standing in a white dress my mother had pressed the night before. The church smelled of lilies and furniture polish. Everyone kept whispering how beautiful the day was, how lucky I was, and maybe from the outside it did look that way. The organ began to play, and the doors opened in front of me. My father squeezed my arm and smiled like he'd just handed the world to me. But as I took that first step down the aisle, something cold settled quietly inside my chest. Not fear exactly, not nerves either. It was a kind of knowing, the kind that arrives without explanation, and refuses to leave. I should have listened to it. Because before I even reached the end of that aisle, I already knew I was marrying the wrong man, and somehow I walked forward anyway. I grew up in a small town where people believed life followed a certain order. You finished school, you found steady work, you married someone respectable, and you stayed married until the day one of you was buried under the churchyard oak tree. No one really questioned it. That was just how life worked. My parents had been married 42 years when my father died. My mother used to say love was not about excitement. She said it was about endurance, about waking up every morning and choosing the same person again. I believed her. I truly did. When I was young, I wasn't the kind of girl boys chased after. I was quiet, a little serious, the sort who spent afternoons reading by the window while other girls laughed loudly in the street. My teachers liked me because I listened carefully. My mother liked me because I was dependable. But I sometimes wondered if anyone would ever really see me. Then when I was 19, Daniel walked into my life. He was 2 years older than me and worked at the hardware store on Main Street. Tall, broad-shouldered, the sort of man people noticed when he entered a room. He had a confident way of speaking that made everyone feel like he knew exactly what he was doing. The first time we spoke, I had gone into the store to buy nails for my father. Daniel carried the box to the counter and smiled at me like he had known me for years. "You're Mr. Carter's daughter, aren't you?" he said. I remember feeling surprised he even knew who I was. In a town like ours, though, people noticed everything. From that day on, he always found a reason to talk to me. If I passed the store, he'd step outside. If I walked home from church, somehow he'd be walking the same direction. And slowly, very slowly, I got used to his attention. No one had ever looked at me the way Daniel did, like I was something rare. My mother noticed it too. She would watch us from the kitchen window when he came to walk me home, and later she'd smile, that quiet smile mothers have when they believe their daughter's life is unfolding exactly the way it should. "You could do far worse than a man like Daniel," she told me once while drying dishes. At the time, I thought she was right. Daniel had plans. He talked about opening his own business someday. He talked about buying a house near the river with a porch and a garden. He spoke about the future as if it were already waiting for us. When he asked me to marry him, it happened on a warm evening in late spring. We were sitting on a wooden bench near the churchyard. The sun was low, turning the sky orange behind the trees. He didn't kneel like men do in the movies. Daniel was never a man for grand gestures. He simply took my hand and said, "We'd make a good life together." Not "I love you." Not "I can't live without you." Just that. And I said yes. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if that moment should have told me something. But when you're young, you don't question happiness when it finally arrives. You accept it the way you accept sunshine after rain. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of small preparations. My mother helped sew my dress. My father repaired the old fence behind the house so relatives could gather there after the ceremony. Everyone seemed pleased. Daniel visited often, though he was not a particularly affectionate man. He didn't hold my hand much. He didn't say sweet things the way some couples did. But I told myself that wasn't important. Love, I believed then, was something quieter. There were moments, though, that left small shadows in my mind. One evening we were walking past the bakery when I mentioned I had thought about taking a bookkeeping course in the city someday. Numbers had always come easily to me. Daniel stopped walking and looked at me strangely. "What for?" he asked. I laughed a little, thinking he was joking. "I just think it would be interesting," I said. But he shook his head. "You won't need that once we're married." His tone wasn't cruel. It was simply firm, like a decision had already been made. I remember feeling something shift inside me then, though I couldn't quite name it. Another time, at a small dinner with friends, someone asked Daniel what he liked most about me. He smiled and wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "She's steady," he said. "Doesn't cause trouble." Everyone laughed, including me. But later that night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered why those words had unsettled me. Steady, not kind, not intelligent, not someone he loved deeply, just steady. Still, life continued moving forward. Wedding invitations were mailed. The church was reserved. My dress was finished and hung carefully in the closet. 2 nights before the wedding, my father sat beside me on the porch while the crickets chirped in the dark. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little," I admitted. He nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal." I remember wanting to ask him something bigger, something I didn't fully understand myself. But I didn't, because everyone around me seemed so certain. And when you're 21, certainty from others can feel stronger than doubt inside your own heart. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear. My mother helped button the back of my dress while humming softly. My friends arranged flowers in the church. People kept saying how lucky I was. I believed them, or at least I tried to. But as I stood at the back of that church, Waiting for the doors to open, I noticed something strange. Daniel hadn't come to see me before the ceremony. Most men at least tried to steal a moment with their bride that morning, but he hadn't. Someone said he was outside with the other men, laughing loudly near the church steps. I remember thinking that seemed odd. Then the organ began to play. My father took my arm and smiled with pride. The doors slowly opened, and that was the moment when everything inside me suddenly went very quiet. When the doors opened and the music started, the entire church turned to look at me. I remember the sunlight spilling through the tall stained glass windows, painting colors across the aisle. I remember my mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. I remember the smell of those lilies so strong it almost made my head spin. And I remember Daniel standing at the front. He looked handsome in his dark suit, calm, confident, almost impatient. The strange thing was, he didn't look at me the way a groom usually looks at his bride. There was no softness in his eyes, no warmth, just expectation. Like I was arriving exactly on schedule. That cold knowing I told you about earlier settled deeper into my chest with every step I took down that aisle. My heels clicked against the wooden floor, echoing through the church, and with each sound I had the oddest thought. I could still turn around. It would have been simple, just a few steps backward, a quiet apology, a shocked crowd. But instead I kept walking. Because the truth is, when you grow up in a place like mine, you learn something very early. You don't ruin a wedding. You don't embarrass your parents. You don't become the story people whisper about at the grocery store. So I reached the altar. Daniel took my hands, and the ceremony began. I remember almost nothing about the vows themselves. The minister spoke about commitment and partnership and the sacred promise of marriage, words that sounded heavy and important. Daniel repeated them easily. When it was my turn, my voice trembled just enough that the minister smiled gently and said, "Take your time, dear." Everyone thought it was nerves, but it wasn't nerves. It was that quiet voice inside me asking a question I was trying very hard not to hear. The wedding passed quickly after that. There was applause, photographs, rice thrown on the church steps. My mother hugged me tightly and whispered, "You look so happy." I hugged her back, and for a moment I almost believed it. The reception was held behind my parents' house. Long wooden tables, lemonade in glass pitchers, neighbors laughing under strings of paper lanterns. Daniel spent most of the afternoon with the men from the hardware store. They slapped him on the back and filled his glass again and again. I noticed he never once came looking for me. Not when the cake was cut. Not when the music started. Not even when my father made a speech about family and loyalty. I told myself it didn't matter. Weddings were chaotic things. Everyone was busy. But I remember standing alone near the garden fence, watching him from across the yard. He looked happy, just not with me. Later that evening, when most of the guests had gone, we packed our suitcases into Daniel's car. We were leaving for a small cabin by the lake 2 towns over. The drive there was quiet. I tried to make conversation. I asked if he liked the ceremony, if he thought the food had been good, if his mother enjoyed the day. His answers were short. Yeah, it was fine. You worry too much. Finally, he reached over and turned on the radio, ending the conversation entirely. That was the first night I truly felt the distance between us. At the cabin, Daniel unpacked quickly and sat down on the bed, kicking off his shoes. I stood near the window, looking out at the dark water of the lake. I remember hoping he would come stand beside me. He didn't. Instead, he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "You'll make a good wife," he said. I turned toward him. There was again that strange choice of words. Good wife. Not partner. Not love. Just useful. The next morning he woke early and went fishing without asking if I wanted to come. When he returned hours later, he seemed annoyed to find me reading a book on the porch. "You're going to have to get used to keeping busy," he said. "I don't like idle people." I laughed awkwardly, thinking maybe he was teasing. But Daniel wasn't teasing. The rest of that week revealed things I had never noticed before. He corrected the way I folded clothes. He told me I talked too much when we met strangers. He said a wife should support her husband's plans, not create her own. Each comment was small by itself, harmless enough that I could pretend it meant nothing. But together, they began forming a shape I didn't like. Still, when we returned home, life moved forward. We bought a modest house near the edge of town. Daniel worked long hours and talked constantly about expanding the hardware store business. I kept the house clean, cooked meals, and learned to stay quiet when his mood turned sharp. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. Neighbors admired our tidy home. My mother proudly told people how responsible Daniel was. And slowly, I became very good at smiling. Years passed like that, but the distance between us didn't shrink. It grew. Daniel rarely asked what I thought about anything. Decisions were simply announced. Money was controlled carefully. My dreams of studying bookkeeping were quietly dismissed again and again. "You don't need that," he'd say. "You have a home." And I convinced myself that maybe this was just what marriage looked like. Maybe love really was endurance, the way my mother described. But sometimes late at night, when the house was silent, I would remember the feeling I had walking down that aisle. That quiet warning, the one I ignored. And every year that passed made one truth harder to escape. The voice inside me had not been wrong. It had been trying to save me. But by the time I truly understood that, my life with Daniel was already far too deep to untangle. Years have a strange way of passing when you live inside a quiet disappointment. At first you notice every little hurt, every sharp word, every lonely dinner. But after enough time, those moments begin to blend together until they feel like ordinary life. That's what happened to me. Daniel built the future. he always talked about. Within 10 years, he owned the hardware store. Within 20, he owned 2. People in town respected him. They called him hardworking, disciplined, dependable. And they were right. Daniel was all of those things. He just wasn't kind. Not cruel in the dramatic ways people imagine. He never shouted in public. Never embarrassed me in front of others. But kindness was something he seemed to have misplaced somewhere long before I met him. Affection, too. Our house was always orderly. Our bills were always paid. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had figured life out. But inside those walls, we lived like polite strangers sharing responsibilities. We had 2 children, a boy first and then a girl 3 years later. Those children became the brightest parts of my life. When they were small, the house felt warm in ways it never had before. Their laughter filled spaces Daniel never could. He was not a terrible father, just a distant one. He believed providing was the same as loving. So he worked long hours and expected gratitude in return. Our son tried very hard to please him. I remember the boy following Daniel around the garage, hoping for praise after fixing something small. Sometimes Daniel would nod approvingly. More often he'd simply say, "You missed a spot." Our daughter was different. She had my quiet nature, but also a sharp way of noticing things. When she was about 12, she once asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Mom," she said softly while we washed dishes, "why do you and Dad never laugh together?" I stood there with soap on my hands, unable to answer. Children see truths adults pretend not to notice. The years kept moving forward. Birthdays, holidays, graduations. Daniel and I aged beside each other like 2 trees planted too close together, their roots tangled, but their branches never touching. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had listened to that feeling in the church aisle. If I had turned around. If I had been brave enough to disappoint everyone for the sake of my own heart. But life does not offer rewinds. You live the story you choose. Then one winter evening, when I was 68, something happened that changed the way I saw everything. Daniel had a mild stroke. It wasn't severe enough to take his life, but it slowed him down. His right hand trembled slightly afterward, and the doctors insisted he retire from the store. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel was forced to sit still. Retirement did not suit him. Without work to occupy him, the silence of our house grew heavier. He spent long afternoons in his chair by the window, watching cars pass. One day, while I was making tea, he spoke unexpectedly. "Do you remember our wedding day?" he asked. The question startled me. "Of course," I said. He stared out the window for a long moment before speaking again. I almost didn't show up. I turned toward him slowly. "What do you mean?" He rubbed his hands together, something he often did when he was uneasy. "There was a girl," he said, "before you." The words landed quietly between us. Her name, he told me, was Margaret. They had dated for years before I came along. But Margaret had moved to another city, and Daniel believed she would never return. So when he met me, he decided to marry. Not because he loved me deeply, but because, as he once said on that bench long ago, we would make a good life. Then, the morning of our wedding, he received a letter. Margaret had come back to town. She wanted to see him. I felt the old cold feeling from the church aisle creep back in my chest. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I went to the church anyway." That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just the simple statement of a decision made nearly 50 years earlier. And suddenly everything made sense. The distance, the indifference, the way he looked at me that day, at the altar. I had not imagined it. Daniel had walked into that marriage already somewhere else. But the strangest part of that conversation wasn't anger. I didn't feel rage. I felt relief. Because in that moment, I finally understood something that had haunted me for decades. The cold knowing I felt on my wedding day wasn't just fear. It was truth. My heart had recognized something my mind wasn't ready to accept. Daniel died 7 years later. At the funeral, people spoke about his dedication, his work ethic, his responsibility. All true things. I stood beside the casket and listened politely. But inside, I was thinking about a young woman in a white dress walking down a church aisle, and the quiet voice she ignored. Now I am 90 years old. Most of my life is behind me. My children have families of their own. My grandchildren visit and ask about the past. Sometimes they ask about Daniel. I never speak badly of him. He gave me 2 wonderful children. He worked hard. He lived the only way he knew how. But if there's one thing I wish I could tell that young woman standing at the back of the church, it would be this. When your heart whispers the truth, listen. Because the hardest life lessons are not the ones we never hear. They are the ones we hear clearly and choose to ignore.